The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Natalie Hayes adjusted the 4-line on Captain Marcus Webb with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, 3 years of trauma rotations, 2 combat tours, 1 life she was supposed to forget. His morphine-clouded eyes opened for exactly 2 seconds, stared directly through her without a flicker of recognition, then closed again like a door shutting on the past. She noticed the tattoo on his forearm during the dressing change. Block letters, slightly faded but deliberate. Natalie, Ramadi 2019. Her throat tightened. She kept her hand steady as she adjusted his blanket, smoothing the cotton with the kind of care that looked like tenderness but was actually just discipline. Don't react. Don't flinch. Don't let anyone see that you know exactly who he is or why he has your name etched into his skin like a prayer. Captain Webb had arrived at Seattle General 3 days ago, medevacked from Ramadi with catastrophic internal injuries. Shrapnel had shredded his liver and spleen. The surgeons had spent 6 hours trying to stitch him back together, and he'd survived, which meant the hard part was just beginning. Natalie had seen this before, the men who made it through the blast and spent the rest of their lives wondering why. She didn't wonder anymore. She just worked. The ICU bay smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Behind her, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, keeping Captain Webb's lungs moving while his body decided whether to stay in this world or let go. Monitors beeped their steady count. Machines did the work that trauma hadn't finished. Natalie checked the dressing one more time, no bleeding, no signs of infection, just the careful progress of healing that happened when someone had enough will to survive and enough luck to get out of the sand alive. That was when Dr. Pierce arrived for rounds. He moved through the ICU like a general inspecting troops, clipboard in one hand and a trailing entourage of 9 residents in white coats, 4 attending physicians, and 2 medical students trying to look invisible. The hospital hierarchy in formation. Pierce was 53, with the kind of expensive watch that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months and the kind of jawline that could cut glass if he'd ever bothered to smile. He didn't smile much. Smiling would have suggested he considered the people around him worth acknowledging. His gaze settled on Natalie with the particular attention of someone who had already decided what he was looking for and found it exactly where he expected. A target. Someone to use as a teaching moment. She felt his eyes on her and didn't look up from Captain Webb's chart, because looking up would mean engagement, and engagement meant giving him something to work with. Rounds, Pierce announced to his entourage, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of being the smartest person in every room and making absolutely certain everyone knew it. Let's discuss ICU admission protocols and nursing assessment standards. Natalie continued documenting vital signs. BP stable at 112/68. O2 sat 94%. Heart rate 78. Everything normal for a man who'd had his abdomen opened and repacked 3 days ago. She wrote the numbers in careful block letters, the same handwriting that had filled out casualty reports in 2019. Captain Webb, admit 3 days ago, Pierce continued, moving closer to the bed, gesturing at Natalie as if she were a presentation aid, a prop, something to point at while explaining mediocrity. Standard blunt force abdominal trauma with solid organ damage. Surgical repair completed. Now observe the nursing assessment. He turned to the residents. Notice the lack of technique. Notice the, he paused, searching for the word like it might be slightly distasteful, approach. This is what happens when nursing schools prioritize quotas over competency. The residents exchanged glances. 2 of them smirked. One wrote something down, probably not notes about medicine. Natalie kept her eyes on Captain Webb's chest, watching it rise and fall, the mechanical rhythm of someone still learning how to survive on borrowed time. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She adjusted the 4-line with the same steady hands that had performed needle decompression in a Ramadi field hospital under mortars, held tourniquets on bleeding Marines while dust storms turned noon into dusk, dragged Captain Webb himself 6 kilometers through open fire with one arm and her rifle in the other. Her hands were the kind that had held lives together when everything around them was falling apart. But Pierce didn't see that. He only saw what he expected to see. 2 hours later, after rounds had finished and the residents had dispersed to other patients, Natalie was at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding in dollar bills for a coffee she didn't want but needed as an excuse to be alone for 4 minutes. The fluorescent light above the machine flickered. She waited for it to stabilize, watching the display glow with its rows of sugared plastic dreams, when Pierce appeared beside her like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. He was alone. That was when he was most dangerous. "Hayes," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear but still carrying the weight of performance, like there might be an audience he was playing to even when the stage was empty. "I've been reviewing your file." She didn't respond. She pressed BE7 and watched the spiral turn, watched the coffee tumble into the catch tray below. 23 staff reductions in the past 18 months, Pierce continued. Budget cuts, efficiency measures. The nursing board has specific expectations about performance standards. Did you know that? He didn't wait for an answer. They do. And you should know that affirmative hire nurses are showing a statistically significant correlation with patient outcome decline in this facility. The room went so quiet you could hear the refrigerant hum inside the vending machine. Natalie retrieved her coffee. The cup was hot enough to hurt, but she held it anyway. She turned to face him, and something in her expression must have shifted because Pierce's jaw tightened slightly, the first micro-expression of someone realizing he'd said something he couldn't unsay. She looked at him with the kind of composure that came from sitting in a gun position overlooking a valley for 11 hours, from watching 3 Marines die before they could be medevacked, from learning that silence was often the loudest weapon in any room. When she finally spoke, her voice came out flat. "Clinical. I've seen better diagnosticians bleed out in the sand, doctor. At least they had the excuse of being shot." Then she turned and walked away, coffee in hand, the kind of exit that didn't need a door to close behind it because the impact was already permanent. She didn't look back. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing whether he'd landed his punch or just thrown it at someone who'd already survived worse. What Pierce didn't know was that Natalie wasn't just a nurse. What he couldn't possibly understand was that 18 months ago, Naval Intelligence had slipped her into Seattle General under the cover of a simple staff reassignment. There was a fraud network operating through the hospital supply chain, premium equipment billed to the Veterans Administration, bargain generics delivered instead, the difference pocketed by people in positions of trust. Millions of dollars. Veterans receiving substandard care. Someone in authority had decided it needed to stop. So they'd sent her. Captain Natalie Hayes, Naval Intelligence Section, with a classified security clearance that didn't exist on any hospital form and a mission that had a cost, because staying undercover meant watching people like Pierce operate with impunity. It meant absorbing his contempt. It meant enduring exactly this kind of public humiliation while biting down on the knowledge that she could destroy him with a single phone call to people whose names were redacted in 17 different government databases. But blowing her cover before she had documented the full network meant mission failure. It meant those millions of dollars stayed hidden. It meant the fraud continued. It meant more veterans got less than they deserved, and Natalie had already lost enough people to settle for anything less than absolute certainty. So she walked away from Pierce at the vending machine with her coffee growing cold in her hand, and she said nothing about the files she'd photographed, the supply manifest she'd verified, the offshore account she'd traced. She said nothing about the fact that she was waiting for one more piece of documentation, one final connection between Pierce and a supply company executive named Holbrook. Once she had that, the entire operation would collapse. She just drank her coffee and went back to work. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the folded flag in her locker, the one from Martinez, with his name stitched into fabric she touched before every shift, suddenly felt heavier. Because saving lives was why she was here. Because Captain Webb had her name tattooed on his forearm, and he was in her ICU, and she was running out of time to keep him alive while she played a game with people who saw him as a billing code instead of a human being. At 1,600 hours, the nurses' station fell silent. Pierce appeared with 2 security officers flanking him like a symmetrical threat, their uniforms pressing against the pale blue walls of Seattle General, their presence a calculated pressure that made the fluorescent light seem to buzz louder. He held a fabricated medication error report in his right hand, the paper crisp and official, a document designed to look real enough that nobody would ask questions, affidavit of authority written in the language of liability. Natalie stood at the far end of the station, updating Captain Webb's chart, her handwriting precise and steady as a drafting compass. The corner of her eye registered Pierce's movement before her brain processed it. She didn't turn around immediately. That would have been the reaction he wanted: panic, defensive posture, the guilty scramble of someone caught. Instead, she finished her sentence, set the pen down, and only then rotated to face him with the expression of someone acknowledging an inconvenience. "Miss Hayes," Pierce said, and the deliberate use of her civilian name was the first blade turning. "We have a problem." She waited. Silence was a weapon she'd learned to use in interrogation rooms and convoy vehicles. Most people couldn't tolerate it for more than 3 seconds. Pierce lasted before continuing. "Medication error. Morphine administration without proper documentation. Patient in 4C, 0300 hours this morning." He lifted the report as if presenting evidence to a jury. "Unauthorized dosage, no witness signature, no timestamp in the system." It was flawless work, Natalie understood immediately. The time was when she'd been in Webb's room, alone, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd held a syringe in a sandstorm. Pierce had access to the medication logs. He'd watched her work, noted her patterns, and now he'd constructed a narrative so plausible that challenging it would require her to admit to exactly what he wanted her to admit, that she'd been operating on instinct instead of protocol, that she'd made decisions no civilian nurse should make. "Collect your belongings," Pierce continued, his voice dropping into that register that hospital staff recognized as institutional authority. "You leave now, or I call security to escort you out in handcuffs. Your choice." The 2 security officers shifted slightly, their boots making small sounds against the linoleum, a texture that Natalie registered without thinking, the way combat training teaches you to absorb everything, file it away, assess the threat geometry. One officer was wider than the other, probably slower. Both had hands free, ready. Neither looked uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do. She looked at Pierce. Really looked at him. At the flush creeping up his neck that said this was personal, not professional. At the satisfaction in his eyes because he'd finally found leverage that would stick. At the way his fingers drummed against the fabricated report, a nervous tell that contradicted his confident posture. "I understand," Natalie said. Her voice was smaller now, diminished, the voice of a nurse who understood the hierarchy and her place in it. She set down her pen. "Give me 15 minutes. Pierce nodded, satisfied. He'd won. Or thought he had. What he didn't know was carved into 17 years of classified operations. What he didn't know was that Natalie Hayes wasn't a diversity hire, she was a captain in naval intelligence, assigned undercover to Seattle General for 18 months to document his private arrangement with Holbrook Medical Supply. The real arrangement. Not morphine dosages, but procurement fraud on a scale that affected Department of Veterans Affairs budgets across 3 states. Not an authorized medication, but an authorized billing. Equipment marked as premium grade, $47,000 level 1 rapid infusers, $23,000 ventilator systems, shipped to the hospital with Holbrook's seal intact while Pierce's contact at the medical supply company pocketed the difference between invoice and delivery. 17 victims of the scheme that would go unidentified. 4 of them would die waiting for equipment that wasn't in stock because the premium versions were never delivered. One of them had already died, Sergeant Martinez, bleeding out in an ICU 2 floors down because a ventilator system marked as premium had failed during crisis ventilation mode. The folded flag from that incident was currently on Natalie's kitchen table at home. But blowing her cover at 1,600 hours on a Tuesday afternoon meant 18 months of surveillance evaporated. It meant her handler, Commander Reeves, would have to pull her out, start over with a new operative, restart the clock from zero. It meant Holbrook would have 18 months' worth of warning that someone was investigating them. It meant the network, and there was always a network, always someone higher in the chain, would scatter like roaches when the lights came on. Natalie walked to her locker, moved with the deliberate slowness of someone accepting defeat. She gathered her personal items, the trauma shears with an engraved call sign from her days with 1st SFOD Delta tucked deep in her scrub pocket, the small military challenge coin she carried, the phone with the classified Pentagon direct line. She didn't slam the locker door. She closed it gently, respectfully, like someone saying goodbye to a life she believed in for a few weeks. At 1,645 hours, she signed the paperwork Pierce had prepared. At 1,650 hours, her badge was deactivated by a human resources specialist who wouldn't make eye contact. By 1,700 hours, she was driving south toward San Antonio in a 2016 Honda Civic, her hand steady on the steering wheel despite the trembling that started in her chest and radiated outward like shrapnel. The drive took 4 hours. She arrived at her apartment complex at 1,720 hours, 40 minutes early, 30 minutes before Maya's after-school care would have expected her. The front door opened to darkness and the smell of apple juice her daughter had spilled that morning, sweet and oxidizing and slightly wrong. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway, small and confused, still in her school uniform with the collar slightly twisted. 7 years old. 2nd grade. She'd been drawing horses in art class. She'd asked 3 times this week when Mommy would be home, and Natalie had given the usual answer, evening time, after the sick people were better. Mommy. The word was a question wrapped in suspicion. It's only 5:30. Natalie couldn't explain. The mission parameters forbade disclosure. Explaining that she'd been fired would require explaining why, which would require explaining who she was, which would require unspooling lies she'd told for 18 months. The classified nature of her work meant her daughter couldn't be told the truth. The classified nature of her work meant she couldn't explain why the truth couldn't be shared. "I'm home early," Natalie said. She heard her voice as if from underwater, distant and muffled. "Let's make dinner." But she didn't move. Instead, she walked to the kitchen table and sat down hard, the wooden chair scraping against tile in a sound like bone breaking. On that table, folded precisely, was the flag from Martinez's ceremony. A rectangle of fabric, 13 folds, the kind of origami that honors the dead. She'd taken it home 3 weeks ago because regulation said she wasn't allowed to keep it. It was ceremonial property, belonged to the base, belonged to the military, but her hands had moved without asking permission and now it lived in her apartment like a ghost. She reached for it. Her fingers, hands that had held lives together in sandstorm darkness, hands that had run 4s in convoy vehicles while rounds cracked overhead, hands that had performed needle decompression in a trauma bay at 0200 hours with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine on a battlefield instead of in a classroom, her hands started shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. From the specific kind of tremor that comes from muscles holding back something that wants to break free. The tears came without warning, without permission, running silently down her face in the fluorescent kitchen light while Maya watched from the doorway, her small features rearranging themselves into the expression children wear when the world starts not making sense. "Mommy's sad." Maya's voice was very small. "Mommy's tired," Natalie said, which was true, which was also a lie, which was also the kind of thing you tell children when the real answer would require explaining wars they were too young to understand and systems they were too young to question and mothers who lived double lives in rooms they'd never been allowed to enter. At 0200 hours, while Maya slept in the next room with her horse drawings taped to the wall and her stuffed animals arranged like sentries, Natalie's phone buzzed. Restricted number. She knew that number the way you know a voice that saved your life before. Commander Reeves. Her handler. The only person on either coast who knew that the affirmative hire nurse at Seattle General was actually a captain in naval intelligence, 2 tours in Ramadi, 3 classified operations across the Levant, one of the quietest and most dangerous people ever to work a hospital ward. "Webb's crashing," Reeves said. No preamble. No greeting. Pierce pulled his primary nurse at 2,100 hours, reassigned him overnight to a first-year resident named Chen. No experienced ICU staff until 0700. Pneumothorax progression based on the monitored vitals we're pulling from the hospital network. The words registered like a language she spoke without thinking. Pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Pressure building around the heart. Death in about 4 minutes if the pressure wasn't relieved, and the first-year resident wouldn't see it coming because the decline was subtle until it wasn't, because vital signs deteriorate like this: stable, 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 then dropping, 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 then flat line. Webb saw the equipment swap, Reeves continued. In Ramadi, before the convoy. He's documented it. If he dies, we lose a witness that connects Pierce directly to the fraud chain. We lose the opportunity to move on Holbrook. Natalie said nothing. Your cover's blown anyway, Reeves said. If you return, Pierce moves forward with the termination paperwork. Hospital's already flagging you for investigation. But you have 18 minutes before pneumothorax becomes cardiac arrest, and after that, he's gone. The line went silent. Reeves had never been one for extended conversations. Say what needs saying, let the operator decide, hang up and let them live with their choice. Natalie sat in the darkness of her kitchen, the folded flag beside her right hand, her deactivated badge beside her left hand, and the phone still pressed against her ear even though the line was dead. Through the window above the sink, San Antonio at 0200 hours looked like a city that didn't know anything was wrong. Lights on in distant windows. Traffic signals changing colors to nobody. A siren in the distance, always a siren, always someone in crisis, always a system working because people were willing to break themselves to make it work. She looked at the folded flag. At the badge. At the door to the bedroom where her daughter slept, her horse drawings on the walls, her entire world constructed on the foundation of lies her mother had learned to tell. Then she stood up, walked to the bedroom, kissed Maya's forehead in the darkness, and reached for her car keys. The parking lot at Seattle General was empty at 0157, the rain hammering asphalt like applause for a performance only the storm could see. Natalie's hands gripped the steering wheel of her Civic, engine off, the folded flag from Sergeant Martinez resting on the passenger seat beside her daughter's homework. She'd kissed Maya's forehead in the darkness. She'd reached for her car keys. And then she'd sat in that driveway for 9 minutes, doing the math that soldiers learn to do, the cost of staying gone versus the cost of going back. The call had come through her handler at 0143. Webb was tanking. Sepsis probably. ICU attending had written "do not resuscitate" in the chart, some bullshit about prognosis inconsistent with aggressive intervention, which translated to "we're busy and he's not a priority." The hospital had exactly one nurse with the training to catch what was happening, and that nurse had been escorted out of the building by security 12 hours ago with a folder marked termination for cause. Natalie stepped out into the rain. Her deactivated badge was in her pocket, useless for the badge readers, but her parking credential still worked in the system. Budget hadn't caught up with HR yet. It never did. She used the staff entrance on the southeast side, the one where the loading dock security camera had a blind spot from 0152 to 0207 due to the angle of the new construction. The handler had provided that detail. The handler always provided details. The stairwell smelled like bleach and something else, the particular staleness of institutional air that hasn't seen weather in 30 years. Her boots on the concrete steps made no sound. The hospital was in that strange 3 a.m. silence where night shift had settled into its rhythm and nobody expected disruption. She moved through the ICU hallway with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, head down, not making eye contact, the way she'd learned to move through Ramadi when the goal was to not be noticed. Different uniform. Same principle. Captain Webb was in bed 7, the corner unit with the single window that looked out onto the parking lot she'd just crossed. His monitor showed heart rate of 104, climbing, and his O2 saturation had dropped to 77%. His breathing was shallow, rapid, labored, the pattern of someone's body beginning its failure protocol. She saw it immediately through the window before she even entered the unit. The chart was at the nurse's station. She didn't need to read it. Her eyes already knew what was happening. The first-year resident, some kid with a nameplate that read Tyler Morrison, MD, and the posture of someone who'd never actually been responsible for a human being's survival, was 2 rooms down, headphones in, staring at the computer with the glazed expression of someone charting in the dark. Probably writing progress notes that would be identical to the ones written yesterday. Probably hadn't checked Webb in 20 minutes. Natalie stood in the ICU corridor for exactly 4 seconds, watching the monitor. Webb's vitals were the words his body was trying to speak, and they were very clear. His trachea was beginning to shift. The right side of his chest wasn't moving with his breathing. The pattern was textbook, the kind of presentation they taught in trauma courses, the kind that killed people when nobody was watching. At 0203, the code blue alarm screamed. It was the sound Natalie had been waiting for without letting herself admit she was waiting. The monitor's distress call, the sudden flatline that meant Webb's heart had stopped negotiating. The resident's earbuds came out so fast they flew across the corridor like he'd been shocked. She heard him shout something, his voice thin and panicked, and then he was running toward the crash cart with the purpose of someone who'd never actually used one. Natalie was already moving. She got to bed 7 before Morrison got the crash cart untangled from its position between beds 5 and 6. She didn't check credentials or permissions or any of the architectural nonsense that kept people like her out of rooms they had no business being in. She was already in, already looking. Webb's neck veins bulged like cables wrapped around his throat. His trachea had shifted visibly left. His right chest was hyperinflated and completely silent, no breath sounds, no movement, just the rigid expansion of a lung filling with it that had nowhere to go, textbook tension pneumothorax, the kind that could kill a man in minutes if the pressure built up enough. What are you? You're not authorized, your badge, Morrison was still trying to get the crash cart through the doorway when she pulled open the supply tray and found the needle. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She could see it before her conscious mind had decided to look for it, the way combat training worked, the way her hands had learned to move in a sandstorm where mortars fell and triage meant seconds. The needle was the right size, the right tool, the only tool that would work fast enough. "Call Pierce," Morrison was saying, his voice climbing toward panic. "Get him, get someone, she's not." She'd already positioned the needle over Webb's second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark where you drove a needle through skin and muscle and chest wall to reach the pressurized pneumothorax waiting on the other side. Her hands were completely steady. That was the thing about military training, your hands learned calm before your mind did. Your fingers knew how to work even when everything above your neck was making noise. The needle went through skin. Through muscle. She felt the slight resistance as it hit the parietal pleura. And then the release. The hiss of air escaping was the sound of a man's lungs suddenly finding space to expand again. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, this thin high whistling like someone letting air out of a tire. Webb's body jerked once, his diaphragm suddenly able to move, and then his oxygen saturation started climbing. 71%. 78%. The monitor showed his heart rate beginning to slow from the chaos back toward something sustainable. 89%. His blood pressure stabilized. His breathing deepened, became actual breathing instead of the panic gasping of someone drowning in their own physiology. Jesus Christ, Morrison was staring at the monitor like the numbers were writing a message only he could read. Natalie had already taken a step back, her hands at her sides, empty. The needle was doing its work now, relieving pressure, buying time. The next step would be a chest tube, a proper thoracostomy to keep the lung expanded, but that was something the trauma team could do when they arrived. What mattered was that Webb's oxygen was climbing and his heart was finding rhythm, and the crisis that would have killed him in the next 4 minutes wasn't going to happen. She heard the elevator bell. Footsteps in the hallway, the particular cadence of someone moving with authority. Dr. Pierce's voice, tight and controlled, asking what exactly was happening down here. The elevator doors closing again. The sound of rain still hammering the windows like something trying to get in. Morrison turned toward the door, his face pale as paper. He moved out of the room, toward the hallway, toward the figure she could see through the window but didn't turn to look at. Pierce had arrived at 0215 exactly. She knew because she'd been watching the clock on the monitor, the way soldiers watch time, the way women who know they're about to be caught watch seconds becoming testimony. She didn't move. That was the mistake everyone made, they moved when they panicked. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand resting on the bed rail, looking at Captain Webb like she was a nurse checking on her patient. Which she was. Which she had never stopped being. Through the window she watched Dr. Pierce take in the scene in discrete stages. The deactivated employee in the room. The former nurse whose badge no longer worked. The emergency procedure that had just saved a patient's life. The monitor showing stable vitals where there had been none 5 minutes before. She watched his face go through the progression, confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like controlled rage. His mouth moved. He was talking into his phone before he'd even fully entered the ICU. His voice was low, professional, utterly lethal. "I need you at Seattle General immediately," he said to whoever was on the other end. "We have a situation. A former employee. Practicing medicine without a license. I have 3 witnesses." Pause. "No, it's being handled through administrative channels. But we need documentation. Everything. Now." Another call, maybe 90 seconds later. His voice had changed, become something more casual, more familiar. "It's Pierce. We have a problem." Long pause. "The nurse I mentioned. The one who was asking about supply manifests." Another pause. "Yes, that one. She just broke into the hospital and performed an unauthorized procedure. No, security hasn't removed her yet, but he listened to something she couldn't hear." "Understood. I'll make sure the documentation shows what it needs to show." The timeline accelerates. "Tonight." She heard him give orders to Morrison. "Get the attending. Document everything." The resident's voice became official, became frightened, became complicit. Natalie turned to look at Webb. His eyes were closed, his breathing easier, his chest rising and falling in actual rhythm. The monitor beeped its steady message, heart rate 88, blood pressure holding, O2 saturation 91% and climbing. She reached out and adjusted his oxygen mask by a millimeter, a gesture so small it would mean nothing to anyone watching, a gesture that meant everything. Then she turned and walked out of the room, past Morrison who was staring at his computer like it held all the answers, past the nurses' station where 2 night shift nurses were now watching her with expressions of confusion and something else, fear, maybe, or recognition, or the particular awareness that comes from watching something impossible happen in real time. She took the stairs. The same stairwell, the same bleach smell, the same institutional silence. By the time she reached the parking lot, her phone was already ringing. Unknown number. She answered anyway. "The hospital is filing a complaint with the state nursing board right now," her handler said, no preamble. "And Pierce just placed a call to someone at Holbrook Medical Supply. They're accelerating. Whatever he's hiding, it just became urgent." The rain was still falling. Her car was still empty except for the folded flag and her daughter's homework. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel and felt the particular quality of silence that comes after you've done something irrevocable. Her handler said, using the formal designation that meant this had become official. "You understand what you just did?" "Saved the patient," Natalie said. "Exposed yourself completely," her handler corrected. "He has you on recording. Multiple witnesses. Your face on security footage. The entire undercover operation is now compromised." She didn't answer. She was watching the hospital through the rain, the windows lit up like a ship in darkness, thinking about Captain Webb's vitals climbing, thinking about the moment when his body had found oxygen again and decided to keep breathing. Thinking about the choice she'd made in that driveway at 0143, when she decided that some things mattered more than the mission. "What do you want me to do?" her handler asked finally. Natalie started the engine. The windshield wipers came to life, pushing water away at precisely the same moment the rain kept falling. "Bring him down," she said. "Whatever it takes." The code blue alarm screamed from Captain Webb's room at 0200, and Natalie shoved past the first-year resident fumbling with the crash cart. Webb's trachea had shifted, his neck veins bulging, one side of his chest hyperinflated in textbook tension pneumothorax. She seized a 14-gauge needle from the supply tray and slammed it into the second intercostal space with the precision of someone who'd performed the procedure in sandstorm darkness, the hiss of released air coinciding with Webb's sudden gasping breath and the return of his pulse on the monitor. Pierce arrived 12 minutes later, took in the scene, and made 3 phone calls before sunrise. The first call came at 0627, his voice tight as surgical wire when he reached hospital administrator Janet Kowalski at her desk before the morning shift officially started. "We have a serious problem," Pierce said, each word clipped and controlled. An unauthorized nurse performed invasive procedures on a patient without physician supervision. No orders. No protocol. Needle decompression on a Navy officer who was sedated and unable to consent. Kowalski's voice crackled back through the phone, confused, asking which nurse, asking for details, but Pierce was already moving past explanation into the apparatus of institutional power. "I'm documenting this as a breach of scope of practice. She needs to be removed from the facility immediately." The resident can attest to her forcing him aside, a complete disregard for chain of command. He hung up before Kowalski could ask more questions. The second call went to the state nursing board at 0634, his tone shifting into something more measured, more official, the voice of a doctor protecting patient safety, not a man consolidating power. "I'm reporting a registered nurse who performed an emergency procedure for which she has no authorization," he told the intake officer, his words falling like precision strikes. "Needle decompression. That's a surgical intervention. She's practiced far beyond her scope, and there's a pattern of insubordination that suggests poor judgment and potential danger to patients." The officer took the complaint number, Pierce's credentials, the detailed timeline he'd prepared. 3 minutes. The board would open an investigation file by noon. The third call was the one that terrified him most, because it meant acceleration, meant loss of control, meant admitting to his contact at Holbrook Medical Supply that the situation had deteriorated. Hayes compromised the equipment chain, Pierce said quietly into his cell phone in the hospital parking lot, rain beginning to fall like static. She observed the supply discrepancies. She's too smart to ignore it, and now she's got credibility with the command structure because of what happened with Webb. His contact, a logistics manager named Reeves who managed the fake shipping manifests, went silent for 5 full seconds. "We need to move the timeline forward," Pierce continued. "Erase her personnel file access logs, scrub her rotation assignments, make it look like she was never officially cleared for this facility. If she tries to claim she has evidence, there's nothing in the system to back her up." Reeves said one word: done. The fraud scheme that had diverted $847,000 in VA medical equipment and resulted in 3 Marine deaths in Ramadi would accelerate by 6 months. By noon, Seattle General's administration had compiled a termination packet with the efficiency of institutional machinery grinding forward. The papers were thick, or 7 pages of documentation, each sheet a small crushing weight. Trespassing on hospital property after badge deactivation. Performing invasive procedures without authorization. Medication error allegations based on Pierce's fabricated report. Security footage confirmed her entry through the staff door at 0157, confirmed her badge was deactivated at 1645 the previous day. The resident statement described her forcing him aside to perform a procedure without physician supervision. The packet was ready by 11:45. The hospital attorney approved it by 12:15. Administrator Kowalski signed it at 1300. Pierce personally delivered the termination notice to Natalie's apartment at 1400, standing in her doorway with a hospital attorney beside him like a second shadow. "You're done in medicine," he said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who'd crushed an opponent and was watching the final moment of collapse. Maya stood behind her mother's legs, 7 years old and confused by the presence of adults in her home on a Wednesday afternoon. "I'll make sure every hospital in the country knows you can't follow basic protocols," Pierce continued, his smile like a wolf showing its teeth. "Enjoy your new career at Walmart, Annie." The disrespect in that single word, Annie, like she was a barista, a grocery clerk, something disposable, hung in the air between them. Natalie accepted the papers without speaking, her face that same flat cold mask, and closed the door. That afternoon she sat at the kitchen table again, the folded flag from her fallen teammate spread out in front of her like a prayer she couldn't remember how to speak. The flag was white now, yellowed at the edges where it had absorbed 18 months of her sweat and the dust of a job nobody would ever know about. She opened her encrypted satellite phone and stared at the blank message screen, cursor blinking like a countdown timer she couldn't stop. 18 months of embedded surveillance. Hundreds of documented shipments. The full Holbrook network mapped out in photographs she'd taken in the medical supply warehouse at 2 a.m. All worthless without Webb's eyewitness testimony about the equipment swap that killed 3 Marines in Ramadi, Corporal James Mitchell, Lance Corporal Derek Foster, Lieutenant Nathan Graves. The names tasted like rust on her tongue. She typed, "Mission compromised. Asset witness condition critical. Cover identity burned. Recommend reassignment." Her finger hovered over the send button. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway, still confused, holding her school backpack like a question. "Are we moving again, Mommy?" Natalie didn't answer. She couldn't answer. She deleted the message and closed the phone. What she didn't know, what Pierce didn't know, was that the routine background check required by hospital policy for all termination paperwork would flag her classified security clearance in the federal database within 36 hours. At exactly 1400 the next day, the system would send automatic alerts up chains of command she had hoped never to activate. Naval Intelligence at the Pentagon, her commanding officer, the Joint Task Force managing intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater. The alerts would be red-tagged, priority, classified at the secret no-phone level. By 1430, someone in a secure office at the Pentagon would be on the phone to Admiral Sarah Vincent, who commanded Naval Security and Investigative Services. By 1445, Vincent would be briefing the Seattle field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation about a fraud scheme targeting the Veterans Administration that had funneled nearly $9 million in false shipments and resulted in Marine casualties. But that night, sitting at her kitchen table with the folded flag in front of her and her daughter confused in the doorway, Natalie couldn't see any of that coming. She could only see the edge of her own failure, the 18-month operation collapsing like a building with its supports removed, and the one thing she had come back to do left undone. She had saved Captain Webb's life. She had burned her mission. The mathematics of it seemed unsolvable. She reached out and touched the folded flag with one finger, feeling the rough fabric that had belonged to a man who would never come home, and understood that sometimes the price of being human was accepting that you couldn't save everyone, that heroism and survival existed in different categories, that her daughter was more important than any operation, and that truth was the most dangerous weapon in the world, more dangerous than anything Pierce could throw at her, because the truth had a way of moving upward through systems, exposing, corrupting, bringing down men who thought they'd built themselves into permanence. Rain began to fall outside, hammering the kitchen window like applause nobody asked for. She sat there, mother and daughter separated by confusion and consequence, and waited for whatever came next. The administrator's face had gone pale somewhere between Captain Webb's first word and his second. Webb's hand trembled against the wrist he'd grabbed, not from weakness, but from the certainty of someone whose memory had finally clicked into place like a magazine loading into a rifle. His voice came out hoarse, salt-worn, the voice of a man who'd swallowed sand and saltwater and the names of people he'd lost. "That's Valkyrie," Webb whispered. "She carried me 6 clicks through Ramadi. Through mortars. I'd know those hands anywhere." The room didn't move. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum, indifferent to the fact that 18 months of classified work had just become visible in a single sentence spoken in a hospital conference room on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Pierce's face shifted, not confusion, but calculation. He was already reaching for his phone before the administrator's hand came up, before security even understood what they were witnessing. A Marine liaison who'd been standing near the doorway, Captain James Halloway, Force Reconnaissance, the kind of man whose call sign had been Ghost before he'd gotten too visible for that kind of work, moved with the fluid precision of someone trained for exactly this moment. He pulled a tablet from a secure folder, his movements economical, no wasted motion. No apology. "Captain Marcus Webb," Halloway said, his voice flat as a runway, recognized serving officer. "Captain Natalie Hayes, Naval Intelligence." The Ramadi firefight. November 2009. He looked at the screen, then at Natalie, then back to the screen. His jaw tightened. Holding a position for 11 hours. Solo suppressive fire while a fire team extracted surrounded personnel. 3 Marines got out because she stayed. He paused. The silence stretched like a wire under tension. 2 didn't make it back. Her spotter, Martinez, took shrapnel from the mortar that, he stopped. Some sentences don't need finishing. Pierce made a sound in his throat, something between a laugh and a gasp. His mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish drowning in air. This is administrative theater, he said, his voice climbing toward something sharp and desperate. We have medication logs, we have documentation that she. The door burst open. The man who entered was shorter than Pierce, broader through the shoulders, with 4 gold stars stitched onto his shoulder boards and the kind of presence that made the air pressure in the room change. Rear Admiral Vincent Graves. 28 years of service. 12 combat deployments. The kind of man who didn't walk into rooms, he transformed them just by occupying space in them. He took one look at the file Holloway was holding. One look at Natalie standing in her scrubs with her hand steady and her face blank and her eyes the color of stormlight. One look at the folded flag on the table. He came to attention with a salute so sharp it sounded like a gunshot. His fist snapped to his chest, and every person in that conference room froze because when a 4-star admiral salutes a nurse in scrubs, the entire architecture of the moment reconstructs itself. This wasn't an insubordinate employee. This was a decorated officer. This was a fact that rewrote everything the hospital thought it knew. Captain Hayes, Admiral Graves said, his voice carrying the weight of command and something deeper, respect, the kind you don't fake. Good to have you home. Pierce tried one more time. His attorney had already closed his briefcase. Security was already moving, though they didn't know yet if they were protecting Pierce or arresting him. The administrator's hand hovered over the phone, suspended in uncertainty, while Captain Webb wheeled himself closer to Natalie, his tattooed forearm catching the light, her name, still there after all these years, etched in faded ink that had survived mortars and hospitals and the kind of forgetting that comes from morphine and trauma. Captain Webb's testimony, Agent Morrison said, she'd arrived with the Admiral, FBI credentials clipped to her jacket like a promise kept, matches the photographs he documented in Ramadi. 47 images showing substandard equipment. Failure points. Timestamps synchronized to his classified after-action report. She opened a laptop. Financial records bloomed across the screen. Holbrook Medical Supply. You own 43% through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. Your contact there has been cooperating for 6 weeks. Pierce's skin had gone gray. Not the gray of fear, but the gray of someone watching their world collapse in real time, watching the architecture of their position crumble like sandstone under a flood. Your personnel records, Agent Morrison continued, her voice matter-of-fact, were accessed at 0300 this morning using your hospital authentication credentials. You attempted to insert false medication errors into Captain Hayes' file. That access triggered federal fraud alerts the moment you touched a VA-contracted database without authorization. She turned the screen toward him. His own emails bloomed there, the panic, the rapid-fire messages to his contact at Holbrook, margin optimization, accelerate timeline, nurse asking questions about supply manifests, get her out before she looks at documentation. The thing about written evidence is it doesn't lie and it doesn't forget and it doesn't care about excuses. You tried to frame a federal agent, Morrison said, using falsified medical records in a VA-contracted facility. That's obstruction, falsifying federal documents, wire fraud, health care fraud. Your hospital's legal team has already declined coverage for criminal acts. Pierce looked at his attorney. The attorney was looking at his watch. Captain Webb's injuries, Pierce started, his voice thin now, stretched out and desperate, occurred in a combat zone. There's no way to prove the equipment I supplied was. Webb lifted his tablet. His hands were steady. Photos filled the screen, chest seals, pressure dressings, fours, the equipment Pierce had billed as premium and delivered as bargain basement garbage. Each image geotagged. each one timestamped to Ramadi coordinates that matched his classified reports. "I documented everything," Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched people die. "Who'd held them? I watched them bleed out because your equipment failed. I have 3 Marines' blood on gear with your company's serial numbers." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Morrison read Pierce his rights. He tried to maintain something, dignity, posture, the appearance of a man who hadn't just been dismantled by the legal system in a hospital conference room. But his hand shook when the handcuffs went on, and he stumbled near the elevator, and the FBI agents had to steady him, and nobody, not one person in the corridor, looked away. Nurses lined the hallway. Residents stopped mid-conversation. The security desk staff watched his hospital ID badge get scanned one final time, flagged, deactivated. His medical credentials suspended pending state board review. By the time he reached the parking lot, Seattle General's legal department had already filed notice with the Washington State Medical Commission. What happened in the hours after was paperwork. What happened in the days after was media coverage. The Holbrook case would eventually result in 14 indictments. $43 million in fraudulent VA billing recovered. A Senate hearing. 3 contractors facing federal charges. But in that moment, Pierce was just a man being walked out of a hospital past the nurse's station where he'd made threats, where he'd exercised power, where he'd been certain of his control. The silence followed him all the way out. 2 years later, someone from Seattle General was visiting San Antonio Community College to give a guest lecture on nursing leadership, and they noticed a man teaching CPR basics in the adjacent classroom. They recognized him from news coverage, from photographs, from the sensation of the Holbrook collapse. Dr. Pierce. $18 an hour. Studio apartment near campus. Medical license permanently revoked. The kind of quiet erasure that comes when you attack the wrong person. But that wasn't the ending that mattered. Captain Natalie Hayes stood in the Pentagon, and the Pentagon was humming with the frequency of power and recognition and the kind of silence that comes when everyone finally understands what they're witnessing. Dress whites. Service dress jacket with ribbons stacked like a calendar of survival. Her hair pulled back, her hands at her sides, her composure absolute, the composure of someone who'd held position for 11 hours while mortars fell, who'd spent 18 months in a hospital gathering evidence, who'd locked a door and kept working when everyone told her to stop. Admiral Graves presented the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. The commendation detailed her undercover work, the intelligence she'd gathered, the systematic documentation that had dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud network and prevented future deaths. It didn't mention the moment she'd performed a needle decompression at 0200 hours. It didn't mention the choice she'd made between her mission and saving a life. Some acts exist outside the official record, in the space between duty and honor, where the real work happens. In the front row, Captain Marcus Webb sat in his own dress uniform. His arm was visible, the tattoo faded now but still there, still bearing her name. When Natalie's eyes found him during the ceremony, he raised his arm in salute, his fist to his chest, his face carrying the expression of a man who finally understood what he'd been carrying all these years. Not a name. A legend. After the ceremony, Webb wheeled himself over. He gestured at the tattoo. "I got this in Germany when I woke up," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. "Remembered someone named Natalie pulling me out. Didn't know it was you until that hearing." Natalie's hand reached out, her fingers tracing the letters, her own name, written on another person's skin, proof that some things matter enough to mark permanently. "You kept it," she said. "Some people you don't forget," Webb replied, "even when you can't remember." Maya stood beside her mother, 9 years old now, wearing a child-sized navy blazer. She held the folded flag, the same flag from Martinez, from the loss that had launched the entire operation, from the moment her mother had decided that 18 months undercover was worth it if it meant no more Marines would die from equipment marked premium and delivered as garbage. Maya finally understood why they moved so much, why Mommy had come home crying, why silence was sometimes the most powerful weapon you could carry. Admiral Graves stopped them in the Pentagon corridor before they left. His voice was quiet, spoken for them alone, but it carried the full weight of his rank and his experience and his understanding of sacrifice. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," he said. "Don't ever forget that, Captain." Natalie saluted, her hand steady, her back straight, her eyes clear. The trembling was finally gone. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.